This is the hand of an artist, Franklin McMahon. He's also a reporter. He covers his stories with a practiced eye, a sketch pad, and paints. He's recorded the sights and sounds of this past election for Impact. Tonight we take a look at this unique political year from a slightly different point of view. A portrait of an election.
Tonight, Portrait of an Election, with NPAC senior correspondents Robert MacNeil and Sander Vanocur. Here is Sander Vanocur.
Tonight, in the final program in this series, we depart from our conventional television images, film and tape, sound and fury, in an attempt to inject the perspective of an artist, Franklin McMahon, with our notes and comments along the way.
It began, traditionally enough, in New Hampshire in January. But there were many things different this year. Far more primaries, many more candidates, a huge dose of reform for the Democrats, and a president uniquely equipped to use the advantages of incumbency.
I was born and raised just 25 miles from New Hampshire. I've been coming here all my life, and I know the people of New Hampshire.
To begin with, Ed Muskie had the nomination all sewed up. Everyone knew that. 24 primaries were just a formality, 10 other Democratic hopefuls, just a nuisance.
I speak in a way for the heart and soul of America. I speak for those people who have no spokesman. I speak for the elderly who suffer because they have a lack of money. I speak for the cancer victim. I speak for the veteran who was sent off to a no-win, no-lose war and who has to come back to a no-job peace. I speak for the shoe worker here in New Hampshire who is thrown out of work because of the imports which are coming into this nation and been swallowed up by 20 cents an hour foreign labor.
I realized that when I first came here to New Hampshire that many people had heard very little about me. But actually, I've had a longer record in the political field than any of these gentlemen, including the 3 senators. Now, as far as I'm concerned, these senators don't have much to argue about. I think their records are approximately the same in all of the issues. I regard them as members of the left wing or liberal bloc in the Senate, and I would like to go back to the moderation of President Harry Truman.
We have discussed the issues that the people of New Hampshire are interested in. George McGovern.
Yes, I know. Nice to see you.
Hope you're going to help us out tomorrow.
I certainly will.
Well, we appreciate that. This is my daughter, Terry, here.
How do you do, Terry?
The Muskie people viewed decent, plodding George McGovern with tolerance. Treat his people nicely, they said. We'll need them later on. But McGovern was catching on and quietly eating into Muskie's strength. Months of factory visits paid off in blue-collar votes that made McGovern's candidacy more credible. It meant his appeal was not confined to the anti-war community that Pete McCloskey was wooing in his challenge to Nixon.
And then orders the most massive bombing since the war started. It just rededicates me to carry this campaign on a one-issue basis to the voters in New Hampshire on March 7th. And let's let the people of this country decide whether this is the moral great policy that we can sit here and watch football games while we're wiping out hundreds and perhaps thousands of people in Vietnam.
But no candidate, Democrat or Republican, could make any noise in New Hampshire to compete with the diverting whirlwind of presidential activity. Right in the middle of the New Hampshire primary, Nixon went to China. And whether he planned it that way or not, he probably won the November election right there in Peking, as the entire nation watched on television.
There's Mrs. Nixon. The Chinese style to applaud back when one is applauded and greeted. And there is Joanne Ma, first handshake. That handshake undid a failure of a handshake almost 20 years ago, 1954, when Secretary of State Dulles at the Geneva Conference refused to shake hands with
and our very distinguished guests from the People's Republic of China and the United States of America. It is a great privilege that while we are guests in your country, to be able to welcome you and the Chinese who are present here as our guests this evening.
I've come to this place and front of this newspaper to do three things. First, to say to Mr. Lowe,
While millions of people watched Nixon leap over the continents and over a generation of Cold War attitudes, Muskie and the others trudged around New Hampshire, trying to attract attention. Muskie did, and destroyed what remained of an overconfident, overextended campaign by crying in front of the Manchester Union leader.
by attacking my wife, he has proved himself to be a gutless coward. Spiritually at times, it's an exhausting kind of a thing, and I don't know whether it's possible to continue through 24 primaries.
George Wallace was not expected to run as a Democrat this year, but he did, and he came to Florida. When he did, everyone else should have packed up and gone on to Wisconsin.
Walk the streets of your nation's own capital, the supposedly most civilized country in the world, for fear of being mugged or robbed or something happening to you. But that's exactly the case in the large cities of our country. Brought about through the permissive attitude of the liberals who say, let you be free. Do anything you want to do, and as a consequence now you can do very little. And now if you walk out of this building tonight and somebody knocked you in the head, the man who knocked you in the head, he's out of jail before you get to the hospital.
When Wallace says the way to handle crime is to put a guy with a fixed bayonet every 30 feet on the street, which is what he said, doesn't he know that it didn't work when a bunch of radical libs, some real revolutionaries, wrote the Bill of Rights? Doesn't he know that it's not working?
Lindsay, the new Democrat, with all the fervor of the recently converted, tried a media blitz, but the reception was poor.
Some of the smart guys who say that Lindsay doesn't have a chance in this because he's a mayor and he's only a newcomer to the Democratic Party. I'd like to prove that that's wrong.
I don't know about being a front runner, but I'm a distance runner, and I intend to break the tape when the time comes.
I would hope that we can at least moderate the issue so that people will begin to focus on the central problem, which is how do we bring good schools within the reach of every child? And how do we begin to break down the polarization of our society? And busing, I think, has been overblown as a way of accomplishing these two objectives.
George Wallace asked the voters of Florida to send them a message. Them initially meant the people in power in Washington. But by the time the votes were counted in Florida, them could also be taken to mean the other Democratic candidates. The message was simple and unmistakable. People who could not fit the accepted stereotype of racist were frightened by the question of race.
Emotional proportions that are driving people into polarization.
You're looking at the only candidate who has his child in the public schools in the District of Columbia. I'm opposed, however, to forced busing to move her out to a bad school.
All of those who have been on the Chisholm Trail with me will realize that maybe something is happening in America. Don't forget, every vote counts. Be very sure that all of the members of your families and all of your friends get to the polls tomorrow and vote for Shirley Chisholm.
After Florida, Wallace had become, as he was in 1968, the determinant force in the campaign. But on the eve of his greatest victories, Maryland and Michigan, it all came apart.
was standing about 10 feet from Mr. Wallace, and I heard something go off sound like firecrackers, and there was 5 of them in rapid succession. He was shot where about that yellow horse is over there. He came down from the podium and was shaking hands, and boom.
This guy had dark sunglasses on, blonde hair. I thought it was firecrackers at first. And then when I seen Wallace fall on the ground, he was just laying there. And then this other guy fell on the ground.
Everybody was crying, but there was, the crowd was shocked, and everybody, the few people fainted and stuff like that. And, there were a few people laid out and everything else.
The guy started to run away and tripped over somebody, and everybody started jumping. They were kicking him and everything, and then the police got him, brought him over there, and a state police car pulled off and took off down to Hyattsville. Governor, everybody got the assailants so bad, they just had to take him to the hospital.
He was, Mrs. Wallace was crying. He couldn't even dial the number, and so my mother shot her way through the
and then I came back to see what was going on, and I saw an ambulance come in, and they stuck Mr. Wallace, and I guess it was the trooper in an ambulance, and took off.
And he's from Milwaukee, and it was a .38 snub nose that he shot him with. I thought it was a .22 because it sounded like a firecracker going off. It sounded like a firecracker.
They had fundraisers. They raised their own money to pay their own way to come, and they devoted their full time to it, and they really worked.
It seems that we've done something which has never been done before in the history of this state, and that's contact personally just about every registered Democratic voter.
I feel this is the best organized campaign I ever worked.
By the end of May, the McGovern volunteers, sensing destiny beckoning, set out to canvass the entire state.
And met a lot of cute guys.
I recall that when I arrived here in Los Angeles, I suggested that we have 3 real debates. Now, the senator has an optional bill where everybody gets $1,000. Everybody, rich or poor, whether it's Howard Hughes or whether it's Joe Smith. I took a look at it right here in California as secretary. Working in San Francisco, making $8,000, a single person would have an increase in his or her taxes under Senator McGovern's welfare proposal of $567.
That simply is not true.
Well, it is true. And a family that has $12,000 a year, a family of 4, would have a $409 increase.
And that is not true.
Now, the senator can say it's not true. He doesn't even know what the price tag to his bill is.
I'm very grateful for the election returns that are now coming in California, in New Jersey, in New Mexico, and in my home state of South Dakota. I can't believe we've won the whole thing.
He had won the whole thing, but if you had to pinpoint the exact moment when the McGovern campaign started to come apart, it was here in California during the debates. An ill-conceived welfare plan seized upon by Humphrey put McGovern on the defensive, especially with the press. It was a position he'd never be able to leave. And as the media chronicled McGovern's mistakes, the man he was challenging went from one foreign policy achievement to another. It was simply no contest.
Thank you very much. In just a few minutes, we'll be boarding the plane, the Spirit of 76, on a trip that will take us first to Austria, then to the Soviet Union, then to Iran, and finally...
Nixon was constantly in motion. His summit meetings in Moscow and the agreement to slow down the nuclear arms race came in the last week of the California primary. And even his critics didn't really care if the timing was political. They approved of the visit.
The visit that we will be making to the Soviet Union is the first state visit that a president of the United States has ever made to that country. It is a visit that will be different from those that have occurred on previous occasions between American presidents and the leaders of the Soviet Union.
Regardless of how you're registered to vote, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, Republican, or an independent? And what do you feel is the most important issue facing the people of the United States today?
Democracy this year began to look like an exercise of the pollsters, by the pollsters, and for the pollsters. More polls were taken and published than ever before, and even before he got the nomination in Miami, they spelled bad news for George McGovern.
How strongly would you say that you support your first choice? Very strongly, somewhat strongly, or not very strongly at all?
Gather a slate in California that was properly balanced.
Just after his triumph in California, McGovern got a personal shock from which he and the campaign never recovered. Opposing Democrats, led by his former personal friend, Hubert Humphrey, nearly succeeded in stealing half of McGovern's California delegates.
An entirely unjustified action. We lost in the Credentials Committee room what we had won in an open and fair election in California, and I don't intend to take that for one moment.
By frantic reorganization and iron discipline on the convention floor, McGovern's people outwitted the Humphrey forces, but in the view of many party regulars, outsmarted themselves in the process, alienating too many people, leaving too many wounds. On nomination night, the symbolism was unbearably apt. McGovern's insurgents, using the controversial reform rules, had kicked Mayor Richard Daley out of the convention, and it was Illinois, without Daley, whose votes put McGovern over the top.
There is some, what shall we call it, dissension in the McGovern ranks. There's some disagreement over whether I should continue as a candidate or not. This hasn't been the happiest week of my life, nor must I say it hasn't been the unhappiest. It's been one of the most exciting.
There was no way for McGovern to survive the Eagleton affair. To have acted quickly would have seemed brutal. To delay as he did revived the earlier impressions of vacillation, of not being in charge. It didn't really matter whose name was under McGovern's on the new campaign buttons. Great damage had been done, momentum had gone, never to be regained. Conventions that renominate a sitting president are usually coronations. But even at coronations, things can go awry. But not at this one. The demonstrators outside were contained. Within the convention hall itself, dissent was muted and somewhat choreographed. There was actually a script, and everyone remembered their lines. Skeptics found the convention unrepresentative of America, but the people watching it on television may have thought otherwise. For unlike the Democratic Convention a month before, this convention threatened no values. It merely reassured.
Almost as if an invisible button had been pressed, the Nixon election machine began to purr. Telephone banks, mailings, printings. The best organized, best financed, best staffed campaign ever. And practically all of it carried on not by the president, but for him, by a parade of surrogates.
When we assumed office in January of 1969, Vietnam was an ongoing major war with more than 500,000 Americans deeply involved in combat. The number of Americans there has been going down and down and down since we took office.
I happen to think that no man is as well qualified to handle the problems of this nation at the present time as Richard M. Nixon.
I've come to the conclusion that, everything considered, I support the president and his ticket for re-election.
Personal family joined official family, and the entire apparatus, communications, and prestige of the White House were part of the campaign. It was designed to keep Mr. Nixon off the stump, where his advisors thought he might do harm, to let him be visible only as president, and it was brilliantly executed. With the news media assiduously cooperating, the public was fed a lofty image of the president, above the strife, quietly and effectively running the country. In reality, behind the scenes, Mr. Nixon and his advisors were closely involved in the most detailed campaign planning and the orchestration of everything from Kissinger peace talks to unemployment statistics, from maximum effect in the campaign. The president held only one news conference, refused to debate McGovern, never had to defend his administration, and he forced George McGovern to argue with his servants, the surrogates.
His timetable upset by the Eagleton affair, McGovern crisscrossed the country, trying to make up for lost time. Gone were the early days of one-on-one, a walk through a shoe factory, or an auto assembly plant. It was now a media campaign, hitting several cities a day, hoping to get on the evening news shows. He sought to discuss the issues, returned again to the theme with which he had started, the war. But all to no avail. He had become the issue. Nothing could change that, not even the Watergate.
Why have we had no explanation from the President of the United States about his 7 agents campaigning for his re-election who invaded the Democratic National Committee? They were caught there with their burglar tools, with their rubber gloves on, with their wiretapping equipment. The evidence is they've been listening to our conversations for 3 or 4 months. We now have reports in the press that the President's re-election committee...
It's fair to continue to discuss the implications of unknown or undisclosed or suspected Republican figures in the Watergate matter when a grand jury has just failed to indict anybody at those levels.
Virtually ignored in the earlier days of his candidacy, McGovern now suffered from an embarrassment of overexposure. With Richard Nixon rarely seen, McGovern was the only game in town. Mistakes, and there were many, disagreements among his staff, all were noted and presented, bringing forth from the McGovern people the charge there was a double standard of reporting. It was more complex than that. Given the nature of political reporting, it's difficult for any challenger, not just McGovern, to get his views across on fragmentary film clips on the evening news. That in-depth task was left to newspaper reporters. But in a nation where the vast majority of the people think television provides the most complete political reporting and coverage, the challenger will always be at a disadvantage against a sitting president.
Occasionally, the president emerged for a quick bit of antiseptic campaigning, like a surgical intervention, hurriedly performed where there's a risk of infection. One carefully managed visit to each region for a motorcade, a rally, and away. And despite the mounting charges of scandal and corruption surrounding the presidency, the issue never really became Mr. Nixon's fitness to be president. The issue was always George McGovern's fitness, and most of the country never heard his message.
Sent the following telegram to President Nixon. Congratulations on your victory. I hope that in the next 4 years you will lead us to a time of peace abroad and justice at home. You have my full support in such efforts. With best wishes to you and your gracious wife, Pat. Sincerely, George McGovern.
I have noted in listening to the returns a few minutes ago that several commentators have reflected on the fact that this may be one of the great political victories of all time. In terms of votes, that may be true. But in terms of what a victory really is, a huge landslide margin means nothing at all unless it is a victory for America. It will be a victory for America only if in these next 4 years we, all of us, can work together to achieve our common great goals of peace at home and peace for all nations in the world.
McGovern wanted Americans to come home, but his problem was that an overwhelming number of his countrymen never thought they had left. He thought that he was holding out a vision to them, but they took one look at it and said, "No thanks, not now, perhaps not ever." Toward the end of the campaign, much was made of his ministerial background, that he saw life in terms of good and evil, and that he was outraged by much of what he saw. But his countrymen did not see it his way. Some say that McGovern frightened people. Richard Nixon did not. Richard Nixon promised them stability, and stability was what they apparently wanted and what they apparently got. America is now at home with itself. This is Sander Vanocur.
We'll see you again in January, when a public affair begins a new hour-long weekly examination of America 73. For Sander Vanocur and myself, Robert MacNeil, good night for NPACT.
This has been a production of NPAC, the National Public Affairs Center for Television. This is Paul Anthony speaking.